We've now reached the second last section of what has been, what's really been 2 wonderful weeks. And I know everyone's feeling very tired, but in fact, these last 2 sessions are really wonderful sessions. So I'd ask you all to try and pull your attentive selves towards yourselves and focus on this panel. We're going to go in the order that is in the program. So beginning with Andreas.
Yeah, I'm just going to pass. Okay. I'm going to just limit myself very shortly to settle a bit where we are in the development of these lines of research, which we are now entering, actually in the middle of our last line of research, which we started in the last session on Wednesday. Line of research which has to do with the dream that have always been seen as the condition of possibility, but also the promise involved in translation, that is the language of kinship. How can we rethink the language of kinship in ways that are not universal, that they are not originary, so there's no one language that has a privilege, but there's also not a kind of universal language that overlaps with the structure to reason, but to thinking in a different way and to find kinship and to be able to find foundations for the individual, the subjectivities, the communities, the political systems, institutions in general, through a new or a different model of the language of kinship based on translation. So to start, just a brief summary of the movement we have done so far in the lines of research. Since poetic translation, we saw at the beginning, does not take the form of a transfer or restitution of the full stable meaning of the original, but already in synchronical terms, we saw that can be determined, among others, as the hosting of the foreign ways of signifying. A performance that from a diachronic point of view, we saw afterwards in the third line of research, leads to the unfolding of a certain pending signification of the past, an afterlife capable of making history. Now, and here I move to this final line of research, the effect foreshadowed, or the promise embodied in this sustained hospitality between tongues in space and in time, is a growing and active mix or interbreeding between languages, an irreducible linguistic interbreeding that can be proposed as a utopian language of kinship between tongues, a different model of foundation that allows one to rethink the transcendental constitution of subjectivities and cultures. In its most basic and obvious aspect, the kinship between tongues, as I've been insisting, which is a condition of possibility of translation, and at the same time, the ultimate promise it embodies, means neither the Enlightenment ideal of a universal language, nor the romantic dream of a pure originary tongue, but rather that which is produced and promised by sustained hospitality between languages in space and time, an active contagion of ways of signifying from one language to the other. The series of reciprocal alterations and influences between languages and literatures would seem to produce and announce this sphere of kinship as a sphere of interbreeding, as an active and increasing mix that is always produced and attained to asymptotically. Take this passage from Franz Rosenzweig, which I think is very illuminating in this new way of looking at things, is what you have as the big quote 1 there in the handout. I'm going to read only 2 quotes today. So Rosenzweig says, quote 1, "The absolute possibility of such a renovation of a specific language by a foreign one in translation implies that, just as every tongue has given birth to each of its speakers, so all human speech, all the foreign tongues that are spoken and have been spoken, are contained in it, at least in nuce." And this is in fact the case. There is only one language. There are no linguistic peculiarities in one language that cannot be found, if only in Nuce, in any other. On this essential unity of all languages, and on the commandment based on this unity, that of universal understanding, both the possibility and the task of translation, its can, may, and must rely. We can translate, because each language contains the possibility of every other. We may translate, when that possibility is actualized by cultivation of those fallow fields, and we must translate, to hasten the arrival of that concord of languages which can only occur within each of them, and not in empty space. It seems to me that Rosenzweig makes at least 2 points that are crucial for the delimitation of this language of kinship promised by translation between tongues. First, he points out that concord between tongues, the essential unity of all languages associated with the commandment of universal understanding, can only arise within historical tongues as such, inside them, not in the empty space of a supralinguistic or suprahistorical abstraction. What we are talking about is not a full-blown language revealed at the origin or the universal language of reason, but a language that is constructed as one tongue is renewed by another in that space of hospitality, which is translation. Second, he points out that this overarching human language is not the present result of the current confluences between languages, but a possibility and virtuality, inasmuch as all tongues are contained in Nuce within it. Therefore, this language of kinship between tongues, a condition of possibility for kinship between human beings as inhabitants of language, is not a fully formed present linguistic substance that might one day impose itself as such, but rather an ongoing process, the actual performance of incessant hospitality, contagion, and interbreeding that takes place in translation itself. For the dispersal and difference of the historical tongues cannot be reversed. On the contrary, they are increased by the very operation whereby tongues complement one another in translation. This is a paradox, but it's true. I mean, if languages are systems, when you have a box, it's different. But when you have a system where everything works together, or organism, when you introduce a new element, at the same time that they share more common elements with other languages, they redefine the relations of the systems, which creates new differences. So more differences with the other languages. So the more you relate to one another, the more differences you create. This seems to be a paradox, but it's not a paradox. In this sense, as Benjamin states, quote 2, any translation is just a rather transitory and provisional way of dealing with the differences of languages. A resolution of these differences that is not temporary and provisional, an instantaneous and permanent resolution is denied to man. At least it is not for him to aspire to it. The language prefigured and activated in translation appears to resist totalization, not only as a virtuality then, but also as a form of complementation between tongues that does not annul difference, but intensify it, this difference being something that expresses an essential character of languages and of peoples as inhabitants of language. Thus, a more radical question could be asked here to end. I mean, is this contagion, this marranism, this Spanish word, marrano, not at work in all literature, indeed operative beneath the seeming homogeneity of every historical language? For the translation that has taken place, with its grafting of ways of signifying, its visiting between tongues through history, would seem to make it impossible to conceive of any tongue, any language, as a pure identity. Rather, all languages are determined as contaminated constructs from mixed marriages, mixed origins, owing to an earlier and irreducible presence of the foreign that calls into question the identity and homogeneity of the so-called native. This is, it seems to me, what a patient approach to literary translation could reveal in its final, or could reveal as its final bet. On this utopian language of kinship as a new model of kinship as such, as a recognition that all identity is constituted and always has been constituted by an irreducible translation. That all possession and kinship are right midday through a movement of wandering and displacement. If to continue thinking the most urgent problems, one places oneself, human beings, not just in language, as philosophy has been doing for over a century, but one places between tongues. One places oneself in language as translation, as a performance that does not belong to any particular tongue, but operates between them. So what if we think ourselves, instead of inhabitants of language, inhabitants of a space between tongues? Then one comes to question a kind of right of ownership and sovereignty that has been used to be associated since the Enlightenment and the Romantic period to the identity of the language. It is here that a patient examination of the strict specificity of the operations and results of poetic translation would be able to illuminate a wider and more positive consideration of the identity of those inhabitant tongues, subjectivities, communities, cultures, just at a time when the old national and identity patterns are being overwhelmed and when the experiences of pace and time that different cultures have long considered their own are being rapidly transformed. I have 1 minute. To look ahead to the final challenges raised by an approach to literary translation in a summary at the limits of the acceptable, I will just conclude by drawing attention to at least 2 of the different directions in which this language of kinship as translation or active and irreducible contagion redefines simple identity and sovereignty. First of all, one could say that the ultimate law of translation as a mixed language of kinship would debar any subjectivity from a claim to simple self-constitution and self-identification. If we are to carry on maintaining that human beings inhabit language, we would have to add that our subjectivities open up along with our own language are penetrated by the foreign in our innermost place of constitution. The principle of irreducible contamination described by the language of kinship as translation means that in every eye, from the moment it is pronounced and expressed, more than one tongue and genealogy speaks. Belaying the fantasy of an originary tongue guaranteeing simple self-possession, the human constitution would seem to be marked by plurality at the innermost level of self-awareness. And to finish, in the second place, if the foreign were constitutive of the movement that opens up the innermost selfhood, this would be even more the case with the constitution of the community space. The ultimate law of translation, the irreducibility of the contaminating principle, would also work against the idea of the notion and all it entails, homeland, citizenship, sovereignty, country, as a homogeneous identity that could be possessed and delimited within borders. As an operation that belongs to no tongue, as a language performance that moves among them without fixed citizenship, the language of kinship makes us see that any nation, like any tongue, needs to be understood as an active mix without a single origin or identity. Thus, it is not enough to recognize that the space of the nation, its land and soil, does not have a preordained occupant, or to give access to the nation's institutionality on a temporary and selective basis. It is necessary to recognize that the foreigner defines his antiquity as someone that speaks a different tongue, has a constitutive right within the institutionality of the native, which is one among many ways of being alert to the differences within languages, any languages. The utopia of this language of kingship is not transparency or universality then. Historical subjectivity and the communal space appear to be projected from these continuous realities and transfer operations that weave a fabric in which there are no easy transitions or necessary consensual continuities, but there is a recognizable and irreducible interbreeding that entitles what we continue to call the foreign to participation and claim upon what we continue to call the native. Here, although not only here, it seems to me, would be today the afterlife of Babel or Babel. Thank you.
Thanks, Andres. Alejandro?
Okay, so there has been a slight change in the title. In your program, it says The Writing of a Nomad, Translation and Errancy in José de Sama Lima. I found out that errancy is not a word in English. So I changed it. It was a Spanish contamination. So it's translation and wandering in José de Sama Lima. Errancy? But do you get it right in English? Errancy? It sounds okay. Oh, okay, so translation and errancy in José Lezama Lima. Okay, so I'll start with a quote by José Lezama Lima. It says, "I see the solution. What I can't see is the problem." And I start. Translation is not a subject that frequently shows up as such in the form of a systematical theoretical approach in the works of the Cuban writer José Lezama Lima. However, translation as an operation is a constant presence in his writings. What I intend to perform here is to build Lezama's position regarding translation, starting from the scattered fragments where he actually dealt with it, as in a specific object or problem, and also from his understanding of the nature of the image in the context of modern poetry, one or maybe the main topic of his writings. To accomplish this task, the path I want us to follow, and I will ask of you some patience, begins by briefly explaining Lezama's penetrating critique of metaphysics, and especially of metaphysics' theory of the image, in order to move from that point towards the aforementioned scattered fragments on translation. Thirdly, I will try to unite these first two lines of inquiry, hoping to arrive at a hypothetical but comprehensive understanding of translation within Lezama's thought. According to him, the initial gesture of metaphysics, or what he usually called logos opticos, consists of the philosophical posing of a timeless ideality, a pure space where being is axiomatically presented as something always present for itself. This absolute presence, this, I quote, object fully manifest in space and freed from the corrosions of becoming, marks the foundation of the metaphysical idea of the model of signification, and along with it, the birth of the ontological condemnation of everything that appears to be affected by time, that is, divided, existing outside of itself by the unease of movement. To reach being means to reach form, and form, writes Lezama, is the moment in which matter calms as a result of the extinction of its power. In Spanish, se remansa por una extinción de su potencia. Thus, the process of formation for metaphysics necessarily ends up in the crystallization of matter's own power or potencia, in a stable identity that has been achieved by means of suppressing any production of difference. This is what one of Lezama's essay provocatively describes as Aristotle's trap, his clever identification of form, unity, and substance, something from which he knew the human intellect would extract a conceptual pleasure that most likely would seduce him, the pleasure of the acquired form. For Lezama, there was no doubt that the metaphysical invention of the form served as a strategy to establish or even to secure a stable process of signification. The privilege that Logos Opticos gave to presence entailed the correlative invention of an entity of second order called image, which, as each of us knows almost by metaphysical instinct, is built on a structure of reference. Ontologically, an image cannot go beyond being the image of the external presence that has been metaphysically established as its origin or model. For metaphysics, images are always secondary regarding the necessary anteriority of being or presence. The concepts of image and resemblance, writes Lezama, are joined in the Western imagination as fire and the stripe of its colors. The philosophical condemnation of the image is inseparable from the metaphysical knot that from the beginning tied its destiny to the destiny of mimesis. As a Latin American poet, Lezama was deeply and strikingly aware of the revolutionary epistemological consequences brought about by Baudelaire's opening up of the space of modern poetry. Throughout his whole life, Lezama dedicated himself to rethinking the image's condition or mode of being in this new space of writing, which he considered defined by an irreversible exhaustion of mimesis' age-old empire in the realm of Western thinking. Baudelaire, writes the Cuban, marks the ruin of the substance. He was the first to suffer the modern torture of poetically approaching the infinity of absence. If up to then Western poetry had been based on the epistemological practice of mimetically grounding itself on some extra-linguistic principle established as its truth, the modern poem would obsessively orbit around the irremediable loss of such an ontological substrate, interrupting thus any metaphysical act of grounding or securing of meaning. In Lezama's own words, in the modern poem, poetry turns to itself to listen to its own silence. The modern poem's language functions neither according to its traditional reference to nature, nor by presenting itself as some kind of autonomous new nature. That is, under the guise of a new presence that would take the place left empty by nature's disappearance. Lezama described it instead as an over-nature, sobrenaturaleza in Spanish, meaning a poetic language that refuses to produce any effect of presence. With this revolutionary experience in mind, Lezama managed to completely reformulate the concept of the poetic image and cancel the privilege that Logos Opticos had given to presence, the positing of being's anteriority. He knew that only by dismantling metaphysics insistent on origins, on the origin as a univocal foundation of meaning, would the image ever be thought about outside of the secondariness to which it had been confined. Lezama put an end to both the metaphysical decree of the self-enclosed unity of the origin and the imprisonment of the image. It was precisely this critical double operation what some decades ago made Lezama's scholar Alberto Moreiras state that his work had set in motion, and I quote, a Latin American destabilization of ontologocentrism starting from literature. What then is a poetic image? What is an image aimed at poiesis, at creation? For Lezama, a poetical image is not a mimetic confirmation of being, but, and I quote, a testimony of non-being. To present a poetical testimony never means to simply repeat what is. Rather, it involves the risky bet of expressing something that could never appear as actually being present, an absence, a loss, something that can only present itself as not being there. Every poetical testimony puts us in contact with something excessive that refuses verification. Taken as a testimonial subject, the poetical subject is by definition beyond the opposition between truth and falseness. It belongs to another epistemological regime. Its task, as Lezama points out in a poetically accurate formula, consists of finding the fictitious body of a ghost shadow, encontrar el cuerpo ficticio de la sombra de un fantasma. This poetic shadow is the reverse of the shadow of Plato's cave. While the latter, as we know, appears as an image derived from a real presence, as a reflection corresponding to an actually present being, the former seems to be defined by a completely different economy, by its search of an impossible image, one that corresponds to an immaterial and roaming ghostly non-presence that at no point allows capture by any kind of mimetic or optical relationship. At first glance, it might seem that the concept of the image maintains here its traditional metaphysical structure of reference. After all, it still is the image of something, even if that something is a ghost. However, one should keep in mind is the internal breaking up of the of structure here at play. If we are following Lezama correctly, the poetic testimony should be considered constitutively incapable of relating to a stable being or presence that could anchor it. Modern poetical images belong to the abyss, to a space that offers meaning no point of fixture, no ontological guarantee. That ghost is a specific example of what Lezama in his works usually calls resistance, one of the main concepts of his poetical or metapoetical approach to poetry. Resistance is not a ground, not even an opaque one, as has been suggested by a long series of romanticist interpretations of Lezama's thought. Resistance is what remains when all foundation or ontological prescription has been demolished. Considering it a secret that resists being appropriated, save by the indirect means of the poetical image, would be entirely missing the point. Resistance here aims at an original division, a differential structure lodged in the heart of the same that functions as a condition of possibility in order for there to always persist a pending reminder of signification. Resistance is what keeps being from attaining the metaphysical rest of the archetype. An internal difference separates it from itself, refusing the consummation of its self-enclosed unity. The origin, writes Lezama, should not be seen as a unity, but as a germ, a primordial seed, un grano primordial. Its mode of being is productive. It originates, it gives birth. But if it is true that it originates, then we should regard it as an open origin, one radically exposed to time. Resistance is what ruins the presence, the origins as presence. Origins are never identical to themselves. Something always keeps it open to the future, to the other, to that which may come. Resistance, writes Lezama, is not, and I quote, meant to adjust the glass, to clean or rectify it, but to press from without, to open a hole through which water may fall as to set in motion the turning wheel. End of the quote. Resistance knows nothing about the future. It possesses no secrets. It cannot tell us what will happen to that first inscription that we call origin. In what unexpected ways will it be transformed in the course of time? Resistance is not the future, but the possibility of there ever being a future, that which Lezama called futurity, futuridad. To create is to confront this impossible dimension, the poem in the end being nothing but the testimony of the encounter. If resistance is a difference originally lodged in being, then it must be also the origin of any creative process, of any process aiming at producing difference. For Lezama, images exist in the realm of what might be, and not in that of what is, the region privileged by logos opticus. There was, however, another modern poetic experience, poetic meaning here an experience taking place in the realm of the image, one that played a central role in the Cuban's metapoetical reflection, the experience that the works of Joyce, Picasso, and Stravinsky had in the 20s and 30s, each of them having developed in their own field a creative sensibility defined by a double gesture, that of reviving the past as a means of searching for the unknown. This new kind of artist was not at all seduced by the avant-garde's quest for absolute novelty, its fascination with sheer future. Instead, he sought the futurity lodged in the past, developing thus a new stance towards history that entailed an authentic poetic revolution, the discovery that the past was still open. I quote, "The greatest figures in contemporary art have discovered regions that seem to be submerged, forms of expression or knowledge that had been left unused, returning their creative power." According to him, Joyce, Picasso, and Stravinsky's creative capacities were based on their talent to, and I quote again, pinch at those zones of the past where innovations were still lodged, having never been fully expressed. In other words, it was through the revolutionary practice of rummaging and reactivating the past that this artist had been capable of giving dead forms an unexpected new historical afterlife, or, to put it in Lezama's own concepts, the possibility of a resurrection. Their practice resulted in an original conflation of the figures of the artist and the hair, the birth of a new kind of creator whose first gesture consisting of being open to insemination by all that was pending in history, all that still retained its creative power. The works created following this poetical operation were, in Lezama's terms, images, testimonies of the encounter that had taken place between the artist and a specific kind of resistance, that of the past. Alongside the figure of the heir, Lezama presented this artist by using a second figure, that of the translator. This is what he specifically suggests in his essay La Expresión Americana, when he talks about the uncountable possibility of re-encounter and beginnings that were opened up by Picasso for young generations of artists working around the globe, calling him a San Jerome of the plastic arts. For Lezama, the Spanish artist would have historically functioned as an active mediator between different spaces and times, just as San Jerome would have done by translating the Bible from Greek into Latin, the famous Vulgate. Translators, at least the poetical ones, the ones that create, produce short circuits in history. They open the space for new encounters by experiencing the past as something still alive or waiting to be fully expressed. They do not intend to bring about the echoes of a distant fixed past, but produce a creative historical resurrection. Quote Lezama, Joyce's knowledge of Neotomism, be it only as a dilettante, was not a late echo of scholasticism, but a medieval word that in contact with him became strangely creative. From the point of view of Lezama's thought, there are few creative positions as close to resistance as that of the translator. Translators, in a strong sense, are established on an impossible dimension, in a space where the relationship with the other, with the work to be translated, is marked from the very beginning by a loss, by the presence of an unsurpassable resistance that cannot be transposed to a new space or language by following reproductive or mimetic strategies. But it is precisely due to the fact of finding himself in this predicament, of having to face time and time again this impossible task and being thus obliged to present his work of translation as a testimony of his encounter with an origin that resists being captured, that the translator, I insist, the translator considered in a strong sense, that is the poetical one, the one that gives us images, is deeply creative. For Lezama, as we have seen, the process of creation can only exist where some kind of resistance is being confronted. This is precisely what Lezama says in Paralelos, an essay written in 1966, where he studies the parallels between different arts, what we would call today intersemiotic translations. In this essay, and after examining various well-known translational passages coming from French culture, the cases of Baudelaire and Delacroix, for example, or that of Mallarmé and Debussy, Lezama thinks about the possibility or the impossibility of translating the plastic or the musical language into the poetical language, and describes the task as follows. Thusly seethe a color, prevails a stripe, or trembles a thin thread within the vibration of a sound. How to pull it out and highlight it? Edgeless, it flaps its wings in the abruptness of a sudden apparition. I will read it in Spanish because it's very difficult. De esa manera hierve un color, se exalta o predomina una franja, un hilillo tiembla en la vibración de un sonido. ¿Cómo entresacarlo y subrayarlo? Aletea sin contorno en la brusquedad de una aparición. To achieve this task, the translation, and I quote again, parts from a color, but catches a sketch or a gesture, and so is the poetical word that then establishes the condensations that distinguish the equivalent subtleness of a similar air. The similar air to which Lezama refers here is not to be confused with the metaphysical conception of images being defined by the desire to resemble an origin ontologically invested with the authority of a model. This is a temptation that the poetical translator must avoid. What he encounters is not at all a presence, but a flickering, edgeless creature, as impossible to capture as the aforementioned ghost shadow. To abide by the resistance, this is what the relationship to the other first demands. The poetical translator must consider the original work as untranslatable and therefore assume his task within a non-mimetic framework or epistemological regime, that of the testimony. To posit the other as translatable would mean to turn it into a stable presence, to decide in advance about its mode of apparition, of its coming into being. For a poetical translator, there is no image of the original work, no mimetic passage between the latter and the former. The of structure of logos opticus is also broken here. So, how should we think of the relationship established between the translation and the original work, between the image and the origin? As we saw before, Lezama's germ is by definition an open origin, one that does not metaphysically contain its self-enclosure. Therefore, the original work as a first inscription has no control over the signification of the series that it opens up, over what will take place after it. Lezama's origin, I'll repeat it, is radically exposed to time, as a germ and not an archetype. It never functions as the foundation of the process of production that it inaugurates. Works never know what they open up. Divided by resistance, they structurally lack the possibility of controlling a futurity that necessarily exceeds them. This explains why, for Lezama, meaning should not be established by going back to the origin, as a philologist or a historicist would do. One should rather look forward into the historical expansion of the multiple and unexpected series that depart from the futurity lodged within the first inscription. This is the practice of a nomadic criticism, a practice that privileges routes, not roots. History teaches us Lezama is nothing but the becoming foreign of the origin. Could St. Thomas Aquinas ever anticipate what Joyce or Lezama? Yes, Lezama was also a creative heir of the Christian theology. A Cuban and an Irish writer living centuries after his death would do with his work the eccentric ways in which they would inherit it and produce something else. Those poetical or imaginary enterprises were and still are possible only because Aquinas' work was, as a historical inscription, not an archetype, but a germ, an open origin. In the end, as Brett Levinson aptly points out, for Lezama, their tradition cannot be used as a ground. Tradition yields to and assimilates forces. It transforms as it forms. It breaks down and is rebuilt. It devours and is devoured. Already cut, it harbors and is terribly open to foreign incoming possibilities, to the unknown, to danger, to miracles, to accidents. Each work of the past, and even the past as a whole, are open constellations exposed to all the process of variation that, issuing from the structural resistance that hinders their self-enclosure, are constantly being exerted on them. Translations, rewritings, rereadings, adaptations, and so on. In a word, to all that history manages to do with them. As Lezama says, we should, and I quote, see time as an ally of good writers, not in the respectful sense that with which we usually associate it, how it makes their sentences better or introduces a new meaning, perhaps not intended by them. According to him, the entire meaning of a work or an historical inscription could only be obtained if we, as a first step, follow the multiple series or lines of variation that passed through the non-metaphysical space opened up by that initial inscription, what Lezama considered the metaphorical function of the image, the production of difference. Then, at a second moment, we would have to display this series on what he thought of as a synchronic field of resonance, a surface where the process of a differential composition of difference could take place. This would be the imaginary function of the image, the creation of provisional yet radiant and multiple constellations of meaning. This two-step process, producing differences and then connecting them by following an intentional patterns of composition, is what Lezama, in opposition to logos opticus, called logos spermaticus. Framed within this logic, poetic translations function as images that, on the one hand, metaphorically create variations of the original that they translate, and, on the other hand, imaginarily change the entire historical image of it by penetrating into its resistance and offering a new testimony of the permanence of its creative power. For Lezama, each work of the past should be seen as an infinite text being affected by time and thus subjected to an unpredictable process of becoming, never to be stabilized or metaphysically grounded. This text is what he, in the end, called image. Thank you.
Yeah, no pressure. Okay. Huh?
We're going to run through all of them and then do questions.
Yeah. I wasn't asking a question. Okay, so my talk's titled Indigeneity and the Idea of Africa, and towards the end it's going to be, I've added a section in late last night and early this morning, which is both the same and different to each other. And it's going to be a bit of a bloody, discombobulated mess towards the end, but let's see how that goes. Okay, that's just forewarning. So, the question of Africa is not about keeping faith. Keeping faith, following through correctly, is not the answer or indeed the question that is called for. Keeping faith, breaking faith, holding to an intention, if not perversely, is perhaps what often passes under the rubric of a certain mourning and attached melancholia. Here, rather, I want to contemplate what it might mean to do, not only to hold on to something, but to take an action, and particularly to do justice to a concept that might not yet be, I would contend, is not yet available as something we can hold or grasp. This concept for me is that of the human adequate to the weight of Africa. Africa is not simply a place, a history, a concept. As Fanon has taught us, it is a name for a lived experience in which each of us, though differently, participates. This is not the same thing as complicity. That term moves too quickly. Rather, doing justice must mean that we hold open the possibility that each of us might need to come to terms with the weight of apartheid or colonialism differently. As Nikki phrased, we have different ontologies of being. However, doing justice also means that we must contemplate how, through what mechanism or mode of intervention, we might create the conditions that allows us a future that is not simply a repetition. The central concept that, to me, will enable us to do justice in this sense is that of the human adequate to the weight of Africa. This is a concept that must be invented and has been invented, and I suggest should be made available through our teaching in our classrooms. To do so, we need to learn to also abide by those who have engaged in these endeavors long before us, to learn from the Sobukwes and Bikos of the anti-colonial struggle, for example. In what follows, I will set out briefly what a practice adequate to this weight might consist of, and then set out a few lines drawing from the thought of Robert Sobukwe as to how this might enable a guiding concept or a transcendence adequate to a future concept of the human. And then I will go across into Jeremy Cronin's poem on the same topic. In the opening essay of a special issue on the question, what is the university in Africa for? My co-editor, Ross Truscott, and I traced the different lines taken by various speakers and lecturers who, over the past 5 years, have been engaged with our center in asking this question of the university. For us, the question of the university in Africa has circled around prepositions, adjectives, and proper names in Africa, of Africa, Africa, African, Africanity, and then even the world. To many of us, these distinctions are not etched in stone. Its fluidity is its productivity. Our special issue attempted to draw the disparate approaches to this question together in an effort to accentuate the productivity, no doubt for a more limited us, of this question of the university. As we sketched in our essay, which my presentation riffs off of, this productivity has increasingly begun to weigh on us as a demand towards invention, a demand we hold on to from figures such as Fanon, Césaire, Sobukwe, etc. So what then does invention mean? One of my guiding thoughts in this consideration is that the university to come that might be adequate to an Africanity, to invoke Suleiman Bashir Jan, would need to be, and I quote, invented from out of the cinders. Cinders, in this instance, is drawn from Césaire's understanding of the inventive potential that emerges precisely in the moment of objectification. For him, bodies are never docile. In the midst of the worst thingification, there is always invention. In the moment of the recognition of black life as a living death, as, and I quote, an election of cinders, ruins, and collapse, Césaire situates his black body as structuring the world produced through it while refusing it the right to be the measure of the world. And this is from his prose poem, Return to the Native Land. He says, I have no right to measure life by my sooty fingerspan. I, a man, to so overturn creation that I include myself between latitude and longitude. While properly this measure is not marked by soot, la suie, but is rather smoky, foligeneux, that is fully consumed through the sacrifice, sooty does carry with it both the reduction by fire to cinders as well as the blackness invoked 2 stanzas later, when Césaire declares, not an inch of this world devoid of my fingerprint, where empreinte digitale both invokes the fingerprint and the process of printing and thereby ink as such. Searing or austerity, we might suggest, has always produced the darkened, if not blackened and black body as remainder. In this context, the invention of the new is grasped as a reworking, not simply of the university, but of the terrain on which such a concept might be lodged. This is not simply political, although it certainly has political resonances. Rather, as a practice that enables the doing of justice, I contend that invention is fundamentally to be grasped philosophically. That is, where philosophy is understood as the creation of concepts in the wake of the interventions, most recently of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari, but which is already at work in thinkers such as Du Bois, as Naim Chandler's exquisite reading in X, The Problem of the Negro as a Problem for Thought, has shown. Invention, then, as producing a swerve into the rhythm of repetition, enabling the possibility of a different difference, one that is not binary and also does not forget. So what could this look like? If you'd indulge me, I'd like to translate this question through a reading of Sobukwe's inaugural address from 1959 as the first president of the newly formed Pan-African Congress in South Africa. In his opening address to the inaugural Africanist Convention, he articulated the grounds for an Africanist response to the problematic of apartheid. His position was unequivocal, concise, and mostly misheard by both the liberal press and the more established anti-apartheid movements, such as the African National Congress, from which the PAC had split in large part due to a disagreement over the terms of the Freedom Charter and the national question. In his short lecture, which was affirmed in an opinion piece that he wrote for the periodical Contact on the 30th of May 1959, Sobukwe sought to carefully set out the terms through which the PAC could articulate the call for a government of Africans, by Africans, for Africans, as the determinative condition for a society after apartheid, reworking the intervention of Du Bois, whom he hailed as the father of Pan-Africanism. Sobukwe asserted that, and I quote, "the future of Africa would be what Africans make of it." However, this confident declaration of an African ground for the terms of a post-apartheid and post-colonial Africa was not without what Steve Biko, one of the founding members of the Black Consciousness movement in South Africa in 1968, termed in his defense testimony at the SASO BPC trial, a certain plasticity. I contend that the demand to invent hinges on the work of reading this plasticity. A sense of the nuance of the use of the proper name African can be grasped from Sobukwe's own definition of it, where African refers to anybody who owes his own loyalty to Africa and accepts the democratic rule of an African majority. Quite clearly, this definition aims more at political rather than a straightforwardly racial or even narrowly national designation. At the same time, however, Sobukwe suggests that its function is double to the extent that it also marks the weight of black existence in apartheid South Africa. So as to further specify the terrain that is brought into play through the proper name, beyond the short line quoted above, Sobukwe situates it as a signifier that operates on both a global and a local level. At the global level, African signifies the desire and commitment to not substitute one master for another, to not succumb to the Cold War logic of an either-or dualism between the imperialism of Western democracy or that of Eastern communism, a condition that he suggests is leading the world towards, and I quote, a nervous breakdown. This is a cleavage that similarly scoured the South African anti-apartheid landscape. At the local level, the proper name African expresses a much narrower and more pointed intervention for Sobukwe. It designates those exploited and objectified through the logics of apartheid, whether, and these are his terms, black, African, colored, or Indian, to the extent that these latter groups are not invested in the maintenance of the system of apartheid. Sobukwe defines this system of apartheid as one of white supremacy, whose determining grammar is not racial objectification, but rather, and I quote, the liberal dogma of trusteeship. In other words, for Sobukwe, the task of coming after apartheid is not one that only addresses its effects, such as income inequality and instrumentalized education system, and the thingification of black life, even as he marks these as exceptionally urgent, but that sets to work at the conceptual terrain that authorizes those effects. In a turn of phrase that elicits an echo of the South African liberal philosopher and activist Alfred Hernley's essay on the concept of the soul of the people from 1933, even as it inverts its guiding thoughts, Sobukwe insists that to the extent to which these grounds of apartheid are unsettled, the name African also signifies the present conditions for a future becoming. African, in Sobukwe's intervention, is then a name for a political formation that works towards freedom, a name that specifies the conditions that order that freedom, and a name that holds the opening on which a sense of the subject not reducible to a difference that is apartheid's difference might arrive. Critically, Sobukwe dedicated a considerable portion of his address to the task of debunking any sense in which race is taken as more than an ideological construction. Counter to the prevailing sense in South Africa at the time, Sobukwe indicates that there is only one race, a species called the human, and he intimates that the proper name African signifies that species' proper becoming. This becoming is an expression of freedom. And I quote, "The freedom of the African means the freedom of all in South Africa, the European included, because only the African can guarantee the establishment of a genuine democracy in which all men will be citizens of a common state and will live and be governed as individuals and not as distinctive sectional groups." This genuine democracy is explicitly articulated in opposition to the prevalent sense in which the self is determined, or at least receives its determining identity from a group to which it is made proper. It is for this reason that Sobukwe argues against the maintenance of minority rights in post-apartheid South Africa, as these would implicitly affirm the apartheid logic of separate communities that constitute race as an ontological ground. What is the point? Freedom is not simply the realization of equality between discrete racial entities produced through distinct communities, but rather is the unworking of those identities as such. To this extent, freedom in Sobukwe's formulation becomes a practice rather than a condition. In effect, a freedom that maintains these distinctions even as it holds these entities as equal, a multiracial freedom, would be equivalent to what he calls democratic apartheid, or what Balibar 30 years later will call a differential racism in his essay, Is There a Neo-Racism? In Sobukwe's formulation on freedom, more than simply denoting a group of people that have their apparent origin in the continent of Europe, the proper name European signifies those who have an interest in the continuation of the apartheid system, those who do adhere, consciously or not, to the conceptual terrain named by trusteeship, and to those who recognize themselves as located within the Cold War dichotomies of man and the racial communities of apartheid. It is striking, however, that the force of the proper name African is not only oppositional, it not only resists the European, it includes that which the European has marked to the extent that African marks a community to come that is not reducible to the terms of apartheid. There is an affirmation in this of a sense of difference that is not that of apartheid. In other words, this is not a fusional multiplicity or multiracialism. And yet the name African cannot escape also signifying a peculiar sense of community that is nonetheless proper to it. This structural ambiguity similarly marks for Steve Biko and Black Consciousness as a philosophical program, in particular the concept of community that works to guarantee the openness of that intervention. It is through marking this concept with a certain plasticity that is derived from what they call African communalism that the intervention of Black Consciousness as a philosophical program is structured. It is in the figuring of this community to come that a sense of the encounter through which the conditions for the articulation of a post-apartheid that resists the pull to be a repetition with very little difference is articulated. For Biko, Black Consciousness philosophy is always about making people ready, about clearing the ground for such a future encounter. It is in this demand for the future that the work of dislocating blackness from the mechanism of thingification opens onto the horizon of its ethical potentiality. It seeks to dislodge both blackness and whiteness so as to enable the strongest possible conditions for a future encounter that might enable the arrival of a new man made to the measure of the world. Community in its proper name, Africa, then, in these attempts to come after apartheid, comes to mark a constraint that enables invention. Okay, so rather than turning through Biko's sense of how some African cultural concepts might need to be invented in the wake of apartheid, I will attempt to briefly place the above into relation with a poem written by Jeremy Cronin titled Mortal Ke Mortal Kabato Babang. Can you put it up on the screen? I'm not doing fine for time. So his poem, can you scroll it up a little bit so that the bottom of the poem is visible? Huh? No, it's not on my thing, it's on their thing. Can you make it, I don't know. Sorry, now I'm wasting. So yeah, Black Fist is the last line of the poem. So if we can somehow get the poem into the, okay. Anyway, you guys can read it. So his poem, written while in detention in the early 80s and published as a part of a collection under the title of Inside, and later Even the Dead, poses precisely this question to community as a political concept. The title of this poem, which in English is rendered by Cronin as A Person is a Person Because of Other People, constitutes a central tenet in the notion of Ubuntu as the name for an all-inclusive sense of community that is meant to be indigenous to Southern Africa, a sense of community that is supposedly premised on openness and forgiveness. We heard echoes of this earlier this morning. As such, Cronin's poem quite clearly has the concept of community on its horizon. However, through the interaction of perspective, voice, and the semiotics of the hand, Cronin's intervention rapidly alters the sense of community that might be deployed from it. To this extent, I read Cronin's poem as a reading of a problem that attempts to produce a concept adequate to the limit that it traces. Written in the first person and addressed directly to the reader, the poem offers, given the context of its publication and Inside, a sense of what communication and interaction was like for those who were incarcerated by the apartheid regime. As Cronin himself has said, these poems for him operated as a mode through which he could maintain his sanity while in confinement. While at a certain level the context of the poem is important, it is the unfolding of encounters as they take place in it that is of more interest to my argument at hand. All the encounters narrated in the poem take place, we discover, on the surface of the mirror that the narrator has extended out of the window, a mirror claimed as mine. This mirror that enables the narrator to see, clear to the end of the passage, functions as an interface between the narrator and the person down there. that's double, an interface that gives a sense of clarity in what it offers for perception. The first encounter offered in the poem, somewhat startlingly, is with a subject already constituted as a person. While it is possible that the naming of the figure at the end of the passage as a person is simply accidental, the title of the poem constrains its reading, marking the figure out as exceptional. He is already a person, without any recognition or care for or of the other that is his naming through Ubuntu would require. The horizon in the poem is, through this naming of the person, immediately turned toward the question, what makes this person a person, and how does the narrator name it as such? To state this differently, this opening declaration of the poem puts into question the terms on which this person emerges as a person. In the next line, we are given a description of this person, a prisoner polishing a door handle. This figure at work, not in the productive Lockean sense whereby one finds one's reason in society, but rather at work embellishing the facade of its own captivity, is located, fixed through its position in relation to broader society, a prisoner. On the surface of the mirror, the site of intersection for the encounter about to be narrated, and also the site from which views emanate, the speaker notes an event of recognition. In the mirror, I see him see, my face in the mirror. The expression of this recognition from the side of the prisoner occurs in the semiotics of the hand. However, it is necessary to stress the dynamic of seeing or becoming visible that frames this encounter, and which resonates strongly with the late turnings of phenomenology offered by Maurice Merleau-Ponty, which I'm not going to go into because of time. Importantly, the becoming visible that is narrated in the poem is that of a double perception held in the view of a single perception. The holding point, or seat here, is the mirror on which the recognition of the face of the narrator by the prisoner is recorded as becoming visible to the narrator through the body, specifically the hand of the other figure. Now in Merleau-Ponty, we get a sense of the body as a quilting point of sense. And if this is read, which you're just going to have to believe me about that, if this is read in relation to the poem, the perceptions recorded and held in the mirror become quite seriously expressions of the totality of being for the figures involved. What is important for the reading of Cronen's poem in relation to the question of community is that it is not an eye that grasps perception, but rather that it's in perception that a form of I-ness is produced. So we're very close to that notion of being in between of language that Andres was talking about, and would have led me into a discussion of the concept of flesh and the concept of interferential ontology, but we'll leave that aside. But we can go back to that if the gaps are too big for people to follow the argument. So following directly from the recognition of a mutual perception held in the point of view of the mirror, the narrator describes a series of 4 signs produced through the movement of the hand that come to characterize the understanding of community and being that is offered in the poem, as well as the relationship to authority that it must negotiate, and in a departure from Greedy, Kirkwood, and Anderson's readings of the poem, the complication that is posed to any expression of a community as a fusional multiplicity. The first of these, at least at its surface, has to do with the proximity of a marker of this authority. I see the fingertips of his free hand bunched together as if to make an object the size of a badge, which travels up to his forehead, the place of an imaginary cap. This means a warder. And the definition of particular signs is always presented in italics throughout the poem and kind of set off to the side. Yeah? This image of a free hand, recurring 3 times in the poem, suggests more than simply a hand not employed in the act of polishing. Rather, this hand is active in the midst of the weight of disciplinary reason that saturates the prison, and this hand articulates the grounds for the becoming apparent of community. Clearly, in its most immediate articulation, the hand operates as a sign that signals the presence of a prison warder through the mimicking of its insignias of authority, a badge and a uniform. In other words, it represents a signal of constraint. But we could push this further through discussing the way that, so one of the things Cronin does is he plays with French as well when he's writing in English. So cap also means authority or heading or direction. And so there is a play there that he's putting into, but which I don't have time to go into. So I will constrain myself. The narrator then describes the second in this series of signs. 2 fingers of the free hand are extended in a V and made to wiggle like 2 antennae, so as to indicate that the prisoner is being watched. The proximity of the warder to the prisoner that is in the narrator's point of view is accentuated through the sign. It is not a generalized authority that is invoked, but a disciplining look quite different from the gaze through which the poem unfolds. Here a second look is brought into play, a look that seeks to rend the prisoner from the possibility of the encounter that is staged by the mirror. I cannot see your page. A rending of the prisoner away from an encounter with a sense of flesh and into a form of relation that wards off the potentialities of this primary encounter. This is a look, as the later introduction of a voice makes clear, that seeks to hail the prisoner into a fixed subjectivity. At play in this series of signs, however, is not only the extent to which the prisoner as a subject is located inside a regime of disciplinary reason, rather, through introducing the notion of time and rhythm through the third sign that is constructed in the view of the narrator, a mode of resistance and desire is articulated. A finger on his free hand makes a watch hand's arc on the wrist of his polishing arm without disrupting the slow rhythm of his work. Later, maybe later we can speak. The double expressions of time in this sign, namely abstract linear time and the timing of rhythm, punctuates it in a manner that opens a possibility for the reader to contemplate the mode through which subjectivation takes place. On the one hand, the unfolding linearity of time is invoked as that which measures the actions of both the prisoner and the warder. The look of the warder that fixes the prisoner in place only exerts its weight over the prisoner for a period of time, even if in that time it attempts to fix the prisoner in its subjectivity absolutely. Time in this moment allows for the expression of alternate subjectivities through measuring out spaces where the look does not reach. In the midst of this determinative articulation of time, the rhythm of movement marks a form of transgression in relation to the disciplinary look of the warder. While the broad structure of the prisoner's daily existence is determined by an imposition of linear time, the actual expression of that existence moves according to a different rhythm, the slow rhythm of his work. The rhythm of work is what enables the prisoner to articulate the possibility of an alternate concept of the subject in community, even while inside the look of the warder. It enables him to have a free hand. As Sartre has phrased it in his preface to Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, the slow and lazy expression of existence of the native, or in this moment the prisoner, is a form of sabotage in and of itself. That the rhythm remains uninterrupted even in the moment when it is used to articulate a sign that speaks to the passing of time suggests that the transgression it enables is not simply for the narrator in whose perception this rhythm is lodged. Rather, it appears as a form of sabotage at the level of subjectivation, enabling a space of becoming in which the prisoner lodges itself and the narrator in the final movements of the poem. While the sign of the watch hand strictly signifies the limited value of later, the narrator imbues the sign with the potentiality of the narrator's own desire, adding that maybe later we can speak. This further level of meaning that is layered onto the sign is articulated somewhat hesitantly by the narrator as only a possibility of a future interaction, an interaction different from that expressed in the movement and visibility of the hand, primarily due to the proximity offered by the notion of a voice. Carrying a certain promise of presence, the voice, and perhaps more significantly the desire for the voice, reveals the fragile status of this community of touching. The narrator longs for an affirmation of existence that would supplement the subject effect of this gaze, a supplement that allows this effect to express itself as an eye. The role of desire here is not straightforward, and I'm going to skip it too. We go back into Merleau-Ponty and Lacan, moving on. To state this differently, the desire expressed by the narrator in Cronin's poem is an element of the risk that always travels with the subject effect, a risk that might be phrased as a taming of desire through the constitution of a fixed subjectivity present to itself and to its others, a fixity that at best obscures and at worst is hinged on this double amputation. This voice that is called for in the moment of the narrator's rearticulation of the sign is neither enabling nor safe. At the moment in which the supplemental nature of speech is brought to thought, a voice, that is tempting to call it real, cuts across this progression of signs. It is the voice of the warder hailing the prisoner as its subject. Hey, wat maak jy daar? Hey, what are you doing there? A voice from around the corner. No, just polishing, boss. The call of the warder serves to remind the prisoner that his time is not his own. It forces the prisoner to confront the fact that he is lodged in a system that distills the calculability of the subject into its most pure form, the atomized individual performing tasks set to the clock and accounting for its use of that allotted time, much like presenting. An allotment that cuts through any sense of leisure. As such, the prisoner immediately responds to the call by affirming the slow rhythm of his work as an act of compliance. The prisoner's response hinges, as has most of the poem, on the question of perception and its relation to being. By asserting the apparent truth that the slow rhythm of his work is deployed towards achieving the goal set by the prison's schedule, the prisoner challenges the adequacy of the warder's look and thereby preserves the site of an alternate encounter. The prisoner, through his own voice, affirms his existence as an individual lodged in the prison system while simultaneously misaffirming the warder in the certitude of its surveillance. For the narrator, however, this voice does not interpolate it, however weakly, into the disciplinary complex of the prison. Rather, as the dash indicates, it slices or cuts into the hope of presence, reminding the narrator of the risk involved in the longing for the voice as a marker of presence. I'm almost done. At this moment in the poem, there's a break in the visual reciprocity between the narrator and the prisoner. The prisoner turns his back on the narrator, not as an act of rejection, but so as to more fully reveal the existence of an alternative notion of community that is resistant to the interpolative injunction of the voice and look of the warder that fixes the black man in place. Critically, in order to open the space, the prisoner first needs to turn himself fully toward the look of the warder. He turns his back to me. Now watch. His free hand, the talkative one, slips quietly behind. Strength, brother, it says, in my mirror, a black fist. In this turn, the prisoner opens the ground through which a subversive articulation of what I've been naming community is available for encounter, held out, as it were. This final movement of the poem, taking place on the ground cleared by the prisoner's feigned embrace of the warder's look, also hails the reader as a participant in this gaze that offers a community of touching. The narrator hails the reader in a language that immediately returns to the earlier discussions of time, looking, and of looking after, which structured the middle section of the poem. The narrator instructs the reader, now watch. This is an instruction premised on time, opened up toward perception. It is an invitation to find oneself a part of the gaze held by the mirror, now. It also separates the narrator from the look that it has articulated in the poem. The narrator expresses a certainty about what will now take place in the future, to which it turns the reader, now. The prisoner's free hand, which has in the wake of the warder's injunction become talkative, slips quietly behind. The free hand is now the location of communication for the narrator. There is no longer a hope for the affirmative presence of speech. It is a talkativity that becomes inaudible so as to be set to work behind the lines of the look of the warder. This transgression, this coming from behind, also marks the inversion of the sign, then signified mode through which the movement and perceptibility of the hand has up to this point been registered. Here the meaning is given first, the sign last. It is in this sign that the most clear articulation with regard to life after apartheid is offered. This is my last paragraph. The sign, the narrator informs us, means strength, brother, an offering that extends beyond the relation of the prisoner and the narrator to the potential reader who touches on this interaction. The strength that is offered in the sign emerges alongside the first mention of color in the poem. The free hand forms a black fist. This offering hinges on the understanding of a community of touching held outside the self through the concept of the gaze that has been constitutive of the poem itself. The strength does not simply stem from a recognition of the self as an intimate element of the liberation struggle. This is nonetheless still signified. The strength is offered to a brother through the sign of struggle. The sign exceeds such an offer, however. The fist fills the mirror, saturates it, such that the narrator recognizes only the black fist in it. In this moment where the mirror becomes the sign, where the black fist marks that which holds the community of the gaze, the mirror as the seat of the sense of community is once again claimed. It is submitted to ownership through the possessive pronoun, my, a designation that had slipped away during the unfolding of the semiotics of the hand in the poem. While it is possible to argue that the sign of community and hence of the frame of the poem of being, in this instance has become dislocated from both the prisoner and the narrator, and that it has been lodged in the holding sight of the mirror, the intertwining of two looks in the generalized gaze, looks that emanate from the mirror and not from subjects, the claim to make the sight of the sign proper to the self, to call it mine, seems to resist such an easy resolution to the question of community. Thank you.
I can start. Thank you. So, for order of business here, I have a paper, a cash out, and then if time allows, we'll look at a PowerPoint, and then if time allows, we'll look at poems, do some close reading. My paper is on the complexities of negritude. Initially, I was going to talk about Fanon and Césaire, but I think that actually wouldn't be fair to the Nardal sisters, so I thought I should leave you something concrete that you can remember about the concept. Okay. The complexities of negritude. In the 1930s and 1940s, the mapping of negritude was not steady, and today outlining negritude is not efficient or vigorous. If the striking figures are the well-known Léo Gontran Damas from French Guyana, Aimé Césaire from Martinique, and Léopold Sédar Senghor from Senegal, what about the fractured framework of negritude, that is, the Nardal sisters? Because any movement of thought is dynamic in which multiple performances, tragedies, and politics are played. What are the other critical characters eclipsed by the proximity and influence of the fathers and their naming of negritude? My question here concerns the lineage of negritude and the misrepresentation of the Nardal sisters, at the heart of which the domination of the founding fathers is at work until today. I want to investigate how Paulette Nardal, Jean-André Nardal, as well as Suzanne Césaire are prominent negritude figures, and that they should be included in the discourse of negritude. The Nardal sisters were auntie of mixed race in 1930 Paris, and my work on negritude dissects how the Nardal sisters were considered too bourgeois, too mulatto, and they were portrayed as perfect Martinician middle class at the time and too Catholic. In my work, I have argued further that the Nardal sisters' affluent background might have functioned to dissociate them from certain women writers of the Harlem Renaissance and women writers from Africa. But in this paper, with particular focus to the Nardal sisters and Suzanne Césaire, the study addresses the different roles they play in promoting the concept of negritude, as it has been recognized. Oh, some space. Okay, I'm excited here. Sorry. That doesn't count for my time, right? In my work, that's better? In my work, I have argued further that the Nardal sisters' affluent background might have functioned to dissociate them from the certain women of the Harlem Renaissance and women writers from Africa. But in this paper, with particular focus to the Nardal sister and Césaire, Suzanne Césaire, this study addresses the different role they play in promoting the concept of negritude, as it has been recognized to be a descriptor of Black internationalism. For example, Jane Nardal's essay, Black Internationalism, published in 1928. Or for example, Paulette Nardal, wonderful essay, The Awakening of Race Consciousness Among Black Students in 1932. Or Suzanne Césaire, The Great Camouflage, 1945, revealed that these women, authors, affirmed their Blackness inversely to promote the concept of negritude through a delay-altered Blackness, thinking globally in the diaspora. That is, I convey how the Nardal sisters and Suzanne Césaire at first turned to assimilation, then to Black nationalism, and finally, they favored a Black internationalism impulse. I show that these women authors' inadequate representation in the discourse of Black poetics imagination, that is essentially a poetic of negritude, eventually wounds the concept of negritude in the end. Although Césaire and Damas were French citizens by birth, Senghor was not born in France. He became a French citizen in 1933. So the negritude founders are different in their upbringing, and their cultural upbringing is worth revisiting through their poetic composition. And such critical reading is possible through translation. So what I'm arguing here, that translation can allow us to sort of decode these really missing links, right? But let me briefly trace some critical gaps. The first break I call the early phases of negritude, missing links, the Harlem Renaissance. So here what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to connect Harlem Renaissance and negritude and sort of like help understand why actually they related, right? Besides eliminating the fact that like their parents, the 7 daughters, Paulette, Emily, Alice, Jane, Lucy, Cecile, and André Nardal, were all accomplished and educated women who remained committed to the civic engagement of Blackness. I want to also reveal that they translated works of the Harlem Renaissance, through which actually Senghor and Césaire infiltrated their hybrid aesthetics of Black poetic practice. So it is important to remember that Paulette Nardal's silence after a very fruitful period around 2 magazines, La Revue du Monde Noir, 1931, 1932, which she co-founded with others, and Tropique, which is also another magazine, 1941, 1945. Where Suzanne Césaire, actually, it's funny because Suzanne Césaire was married to Césaire in 1937. So Suzanne Césaire played a leading role in publishing the bulk of Césaire's works, but Césaire never gives her credit. Yet despite the supposed weakness of their bodies, they have been, I'm talking about Suzanne and Paulette, yet despite the supposed weakness of their body, they have, for the rest of their lives, been fighters for the cause of women and for the cause of Blackness, but also from the point of view of intellectual, artistic, and philosophical thoughts. There's another gap with the concept of negritude, and this is the second gap I call the drama of negritude, Anglophone and Francophone alarming ruptures. The highlight here is that without some understanding of negritude in Anglophone Africa and Francophone Africa, at least in its historical importance, it is impossible to see any shape of negritude poetics events in Africa over the past 60 years. In my account, Anglophone Africa did not see the importance of negritude because of the different kind of colonialization. The colonial history, as Ngugi talks about it yesterday, the French are meaner than the English, so that when they want you to learn French, they want you to master the whole academic, right? So their process of assimilation is different. Because Britain never pursued a policy for cultural assimilation, but typically had no cultural policy at all. According to the Cameroonian philosopher and critic Achille Mbembe, Césaire summarized his concern this way: who are we in this white world? What can we hope for, and what should we do? For Mbembe, the clear-cut answer Césaire offers, that we are Black, affirms Césaire's convincing negritude. So to make negritude relevant in today's post-colonial studies, I argue that one needs to read negritude as the articulation of a Black poetic imagination, marked acutely by its cadence innovation. For example, Césaire poetics is associated with mimicry and correlation, joined with African music and dance that can be confused at times with European surrealism. As for Damas, Damas fashioned his poetic composition in an Afro-American genre through the cadence of jazz and blues, merged with African music and dance. But for Senghor in turn fashioned his poetic composition in French quantitative meters, with no accentuation fused with African music and dance, thereby producing an African dance with doubling the steps by jumping. He does this by doubling the accentuated syllables. Thus, negritude poetics composition engage both European poetics techniques and African tradition. I want to argue here that indeed it is possible to gain a deeper understanding of negritude writing as a theory and as a Black aesthetic if we critically study these breaks through translation, but also the misrepresentation of the women founders, right? And actually, because conventional critics of negritude, they don't pay attention to these gaps. So what I'm doing with my work in general is sort of to illuminate these gaps. Negritude is read differently in Césaire, Damas, and Senghor, Fanon, even Sartre, which seem to cause its downfall. Contrary to previous critics, I want to argue here that the Nardal sisters, particularly Paulette, who's the older, have been characterized in field works that to mention them as movement midwives rather than inventors of the negritude movement. My reading of the forgotten negritude woman brings new concern to the discourse of negritude. So I want to claim that gendering and remapping the movement's origin begin with the Nardal sisters and Suzanne Césaire. What I hope to contribute to the field of postcolonial studies and translating the Francophone text by reading negritude in this framework. Negritude is much more than a set of questions, than a series of answers concerning what Césaire convey as a sum of lived experience of blackness that I have finally defined and characterized one forms of the human destiny, such as history. So basically what it is Césaire is lumping colonialism, the brutality of the black race together, right? After showing that Paulette Nardal, Suzanne Césaire were formidable instruments in their own illustration of blackness and resistance to all forms of oppression for the black world, I must mention a detail that is important. The beauty of these women's bodies was the object of admiration in poetics inspiration, in speeches, letters, including poetics ones. Paulette and Suzanne's writing remained confined in archives, while the storybook, philosophical, poetics, and political thoughts of the founders, that is Césaire, Damas, and Senghor, shines forth even more today. Thus, a mapping of negritude in its early days show how violence is at work, deceptive because silent, muted because of a lack of translation of, for example, Paulette Nardal's critical essay called Âme métisse, 1927, or her essay Éveil de la conscience des races, 1935. So these essays haven't been translated, and for this particular chapter, I'm returning to these essays or translating them and read them closely. Making the question of blackness and negritude even more complex, again, here I want to bracket that translating Paulette Nardal and Suzanne Césaire early essays, we can see how actually their narrative of blackness come from the Harlem Renaissance, but the negritude founding fathers took everything from these sisters. So the struggle in negritude is the struggle of blackness and is a never-ending history. Do not forget that negritude is submerged with a search of origin, an anguish of cultural heritage, racial condition, a historical threat that faces us today. Think of negritude and place a particular emphasis to our present cultural situation. I hope my task in this paper serves as a helpful reference and jumping off point to future scholarship on negritude. Thank you. So I'm going to show you a PowerPoint here briefly. What time? 6 minutes. Okay, cool. I have 6 minutes. It's loading. Are you going to block the time, right? You stop the time. Notice. I want to... Where? This is what I want here. Yeah. Okay. Okay, so we have to go back to this, right? If we want to see the connection between the Harlem Renaissance and the problems of negritude, right? So if you look at this quote, right, Senghor actually admits to this, but no one is tracing this, right? This is in his essay, Qu'est-ce que la négritude? But this essay hasn't been translated yet. This is my translation. So he says, it is thanks to Paulette Nardal, the Martinician, founders of La Revue du Monde Noir in 1930, that I met Alain Locke. So Alain Locke actually is a very important figure in the negritude movement, right? He's American, but he actually came up with an ontology called the New Negro, which Paulette actually translated. But also Senghor admits to something really interesting here. According to Senghor, that Damas, who's actually one of the most forgotten figure of the negritude movement, you know, he was more sort of like, il était, Damas est le plus nègre de nous, quoi. He was more black. His poetics was more negritude, sort of. So here's Paulette and Jeanne, the sisters, right? So this is interesting. So this is Paulette, actually, for her dissertation at Sorbonne, translated The New Negro, which is right there. So the ontology was done by Alain Locke. So here are the sisters, and you see Suzanne Césaire actually here was actually married to Césaire in 1937 when Damas's first book was published. And no one mentioned this, and I think that's a very important sort of connection, right? So these are the reviews they create. And what they used to do, the sisters actually, they met at their home in salons to invite the brothers, because they were younger, the sisters were older. So what they did actually, they took all these ideas from those salons and just used them without giving the sisters any credit. The other problem of negritude, I think, is Jean-Paul Sartre. You know, people disagree with me on this, but I think the way he theorized negritude in 1948 sort of like boxed negritude into the French discourse. So I think with translation, going back to Ngugi, if we translate, we're going to sort of try to move negritude, you know, outside the center, right? So negritude would be accessible into English. Again, Sartre, he follows us everywhere we go with negritude, so we can hardly talk about negritude without bringing up Sartre, right? Which is, I think, a problem. So this is how he defines negritude. And Senghor agrees with him. That's why Senghor get punched by the African scholars. So even though Ngugi writes his poetry, loves his poetry, but he's saying he should write in Wolof, but technically, what the problem with Senghor and the African scholars is that he leans towards Sartre's definition of negritude. So Fanon becomes interesting, right? Because if we read negritude without Fanon, I think that's another missing gap, because he too, even though he learned a lot from the negritude movement, he doesn't admit it. You know, we know he's a complicated figure, but doesn't want to give credit to his professor, who was Césaire, right? So I think the discourse of colonialism, we can't dissect it without going back to Fanon and Césaire, right? So I give a couple of examples here. So the harshest critics of negritude is important too. Another missing gap, I think it's important to share with you, Hule Soyinka. So he's from Nigeria, and this is what he said about negritude. A tiger does not proclaim his tigritude, he pounces. Basically what he's saying, you can't promote your blackness. You know, I think you can argue that Ngugi, that's what he was saying, that you can't say, you know, if you can't say black is beauty through French and English, you have to do it in Wolof, right? I think if Senghor had done that, I don't think Soyinka would say this, right? But he actually changed his mind, right? Later in his essay, The Burden of Memory, The Muse of Forgiveness, 1999, he said, no, what I was saying was that they should not just use French to express blackness. And this is my biblio. I don't have time for close reading, but yeah, a little bit.
Well, you're kind of on 20. If you want a few more minutes.
Just 6 minutes. I just want to
I think that's a little unfair. Do you want just 2 minutes?
2 minutes.
Baba?
Yeah. 2 minutes would be great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. That is unfair. Yes. Because I've been stopped twice. Okay, great. Oh, this is really small, actually. But this is kind of small. But so we start here. So Damas, this figure actually is really important. This is a really important book. And I think to understand negritude, you have to go back to this book. This was the first book that expressed the poetic composition of blackness. What I mean by that, if you read the middle stanza here, we can't see it, it's pretty small, but I'll read you a little bit so you can see how he traces. Well, I don't have time. But anyway, so these are important books that we should return to, right? Because all the ideas that are expressed here were taken from the salons of the sisters. And Césaire books, obviously, is really important. Okay, we'll stop there.
Good.
Okay.
Name the books.
Okay, so this is, the first book is Pygma, 1937, which is an important book. And Chant d'Ombre. Chant d'Ombre is also important. What Senghor does here, he actually paid tribute to the first soldiers, the black soldiers who fought for the First World War to sort of free France. They're called Tirailleurs Sénégalais, the Senegalese riflemen. He did this well in his first book, but then he stopped. So I think that's when his negritude started collapsing. And Cahiers de Retour obviously is a classic, but I think it deserves careful reading. Let's stop there.
Okay, many thanks to a wonderful panel, and I'm very sorry that we're being brutal on this last day. I'm going to open up for a round of questions. We have basically half an hour, so try keep your questions relatively to the point and brief. Okay, Juanita.
Okay, I have one question for Baba and one question for Alejandro. I will start with Alejandro. I'm not sure I have read Lezama before, so perhaps this question is related to what you said, but also about my thoughts about what I understand about Lezama. He says that everything that exists is fragmented or something like that, and but he distinguishes nature as being also diverse, but also homogeneous. I don't know how to say that word in English. And to a sense, poetry is the one that makes the connections between the fragments of things, and perhaps also of the diversity of nature. But I'm not sure how does poetic language manage to do those connections? How does poetry or maybe metaphors connect the fragments? I don't know, in the things that he calls fragmented and in the nature that he calls diverse but homogeneous. Okay, that's my question. And to Baba, maybe extending to the first question I had asked you about poetics. Do you consider poetics and what you're studying as a stable thing? Because since you say negritude let's say, changes, it's ever changing, and the problem of negritude is always changing. Are you considering poetics also like a changing thing? But also context-based, since you say that the colonies of the British were very different from the colonies, and then the diaspora has also changed. And my other tiny question, you don't have to answer all of them. Does all Black people recognize themselves as negritude? Like, do they all recognize that word as something that is theirs, or they? I don't know, because I have encountered this thing that people from Somalia don't think of themselves as Black for some reason. I don't know. Is this thing I don't know? So I'm curious about that. That's all.
Jane, Pramesh, and Ashley, and then we'll see if we can take another round. Okay.
Yeah, mine is just a request to everybody on the panel, but mostly to Moritz and Baba. Alejandro, I'm still working with your ideas, but to use Andres's concept of kinship and this notion of a kind of there's no single inhabitants, it's sort of, and then reflect on what you've claimed, for example, in the new alternative subjects of the poem, that you were reading the new community in the poem between the two prisoners and so on, and then the new community of negritude. Whether Andres's claim that kinship is the kind of trope, if you will, of a new kind of community is something you could work with in either of your two instances.
Sorry, this is going to be a slightly half-baked question, but since Moritz brought up Jeremy Cronin, I'm wondering about the two references, both in his talk and in Baba's talk, to liberalism and paternalism. And I'm wondering, there's a way in which an argument around Black consciousness as philosophy or negritude is sustained through a kind of reading of liberalism and its particular manifestation within the colonial world. I wondered whether there's a way in which we might want to think a little bit about Marxism and its relation to the poetics. And one thinks about this particularly because the 1930s, in which you invoke this emergent form of negritude, for example, is quite critical in the kind of, shaping of a left set of sensibilities. And I'm thinking here particularly of the Marx of the 18th Brumaire, in which he draws attention to, content and phrase and the kind of indecision about which exceeds which at any particular time. So I'm wondering, is there something to be said? I mean, not a hostile question, but is there something to be thought about, in relation to a kind of emerging critique in that period? An emerging critique that is not necessarily one that takes liberalism at its word.
Hi, my question is also for Baba. Thank you for your presentation. I'm curious how you're thinking, and this kind of relates to a question that was posed to you the last time you spoke, but I'm curious how you're thinking about the impact or the influence of gender in the translation of those sisters. So how does it change our reading of the emergence of negritude to think of it as translated by women, the text that you're thinking about, versus the kind of hegemonic story of translated by men? So how does gender impact your reading?
Okay, shall we just go through the line, and then if there is any time, then we'll take a second round?
Okay, thank you, Juanita, for your question. I completely agree with what you're saying. I mean, I think you're stressing the right point. Lezama really wanted this idea of the fragment and the imán. I don't know how you say this in Spanish. Yeah. So I think that when he was like reworking this, the concept of image, he wanted to produce like a new idea of unity that wasn't a metaphysical one, one that you could not like stabilize or bring to a closed meaning or some kind of fixture. So he developed this aesthetics, which was built upon the idea of creating poetical surfaces where you could put fragments in such a way as they will start to resonate between them, but never stabilizing, like producing like explosions of local meaning that could resonate, but never to stabilize themselves. So he was thinking about creating this kind of unity, and if you read his poetry, it functions a bit in this way, like fragments in a sort of open and very unstable dialogue. So yeah, it was this kind of non-metaphysical unity which he was looking for, I think.
Yeah, just if I have just a word to that. I think that there's two ways of looking. I mean, one is the most, I think it's what you said. This is part of the avant-garde 1910s. This form was in the air, the idea of fragmenting and juxtaposing and creating this kind of dynamic effects. And that's why Stravinsky was doing in music, Bartók as well, but also people were doing in Cubism and all this. The other way of looking at it is that I think that when poetry recovers its kind of heuristic exploration moment, it becomes synthesis again, not only communication, but synthesis. And synthesis is precisely that, is linking fragments. Any single act of speech, what it does in the end, if you go like to the epistemology of speech, is to link. I mean, it basically, the problem is that you create discrete moments and you link in the same movement. And it all depends how do you link. It can be by analogy, similarity and different, by simple juxtaposition or other. Now, coming to Jane's question, I think that just to maybe precise some things, I was thinking really on translation as the key concept as a response to the common question about how we create kinship or communion or understanding in a common language. And I was thinking of translation for various reasons. The first is because it's an act, it's an action. It's not a common imaginary. It's not that we are sharing a common imaginary or a common conceptual background, but we are sharing a behavior. And it's a behavior on the second step, which I was trying to defend that it's on the basis of every language, that it's a fantasy that there's language prior to translation. Languages are always after translation because they have put together individual languages, or that people have agreed to create this kind of orchestra. I mean, to recover the Gugi's metaphor. I mean, if all individual languages are instruments where we need to create a common language, we need to build an orchestra. So even the most I mean, this is another way of looking at the prismatic idea of the OCCT people. I mean, they have said, well, a prism, what does translation is to bring forward many different directions in which a poem goes in translation. Well, you have the whole chromatism that a prism unfolds. But the whole chromatism, when you create movement, it becomes white. So it gives you the idea of the kind of purity, but actually it's full of colors there. I mean, it's like the idea of rolling the Newton square. So another way of looking at this chromatism of prismatism is to say, well, look, actually when you see white, it's just that it's something in movement, a living language, but it's form of an enormous amount of colors. So if you go to the moments, the most allegedly pure moment of a language, you can see where they come from somewhere else. I mean, let's take a poet, and I'm going to finish with this. Let's take a poem who is as British as it gets. Let's say Geoffrey Hill, okay? So what's the line that he puts in his collected works as an epigraph? It's a line from Pound. In the gloom, so the line is a very nice line. In the gloom, the gold gathers the light against it. Okay, so that's seen as the maximum English transparency. Well, actually, that line is built from several traditions. It has the alliteration, which comes from the Germanic tradition. I'm going to exaggerate it. In the gloom, the gold gathers the light against it. Okay? Then it had what you were speaking about, this quantitative meter, these long vowels that come from classical prosody. So I'm going to exaggerate it. In the gloom, the gold gathers the light against it. Okay? And then to end, and this is my last sentence, it has the modulation of vowels which come from the Provençal tradition, which he had learned in those albas we were reading the first day. So the language does what it says, it appears all the light. So it starts dark and opens. In the gloom, the gold gathers the light against it. Okay, so that apparently pristine white line actually is penetrated by several traditions of poetry. And that's what I was trying to say, that actually that is a way of redefining the way we think about our foundation of our institutionality and also our own subjectivities, where already many voices are speaking. The question that was put to Gugi, do you write, I mean by Patrick, do you think you write different in different languages? It's also, I mean, we all know that when we speak different languages, we acquire sort of different personalities because it depends where we learn the language with which people. We all know that, I mean, all here, because we speak several languages. What I was saying is already when you speak your own language, you have to pay attention to the different genealogies and that gives a different right to everything you built on language.
So I'll go to your question, since you asked that same question last week, whether the, no, that's fine. Whether the poetics of negritude changes over time, the composition. Right. Well, no, I mean, the poetic of negritude, you know, we have to be careful with the word poetics, right? So actually what I mean by poetics of negritude is the expression of blackness in the language. The way I express blackness in my own work, the way Senghor expressed blackness in his own work, or Césaire, or the Natural Sisters, right? It does changes over time. For example, right now, if you read Gwendolyn Brooks, or Citizen by Claudia Rankine. I mean, Claudia Rankine, what she's doing in that book, it's expressing the brutality of blackness. And that's actually what I call poetics of negritude, the way they talk about blackness in the present time. Does that make sense? And the second question, whether negritude is global, well, that's the goal, right? We want to remind people that the history of this is what Ngogi was saying, right? The history of blackness, even though we don't have the same story. As long as your skin is black, there's some kind of devices that are put to your face that remind you that your skin is black. Well, in Morocco, they think they're not black enough. Algeria, they think they're not black enough. I mean, you see what's happening in Libya. The immigrants that suffered the most in Libya are the black-skinned immigrants. Right? Does that help? Okay. You want to go? Or you should take a stab at Jane's question. No, go ahead. No.
to stab Jane's question. I'm not sure. So, I mean, I have a lot of sympathy for the intervention that Andres made. I mean, I'm convinced of the conceptual moves. I do have a hesitancy around the language of kinship. I mean, I think it has a anthropological and colonial heritage that might make it difficult to guard against the kind of bracketing of identity into ethnicity. Yeah. So I mean, so but then having said that, what I really liked about Andres's presentation was when he was talking about how so languages are never entities in themselves, right? This is part of the difficulty with an idea of preserving language. They always bring difference into them, and when those different parts come into them, then the whole internal structure of the language is also different again, right? So it's constantly changing. And in that sense, when we think of that play of difference on difference in language as being what is in common across them, when that comes to be a question of kinship, right, then I have a lot more sympathy for the term. And I think it comes closer to where, to the way that Sobukwe, for example, is thinking of the term African. So it becomes a mechanism to express what we might call a difference in common rather than extrinsic difference. And so in that sense, I see the play between translation as I heard Andres putting it on the table, and the kind of political intervention of someone like Sobukwe around the term African.
I mean, would you then, sorry to just interject, so then would you maybe go with the Saidian, or the term that Gabi reminded us of affiliation, because it kind of dislodges that anthropological, genetic kind of thing, but it's affiliation versus filiation.
I mean, yeah, I mean, I hear you, and I would agree with you. Absolutely. I think as soon as you posit the term, you'll have to move away from it. But that, I think, is just the condition of existence, really. I mean, the work that so one of the big criticisms of Sobukwe, for example, was the way he articulated his rather complex terms were taken up, generally speaking, in rather simple terms of a racial difference. And he suggested that that's always the risk, and the response to that is teaching. So, yeah. So Pramesh's question, it was directed at both of us.
You are speaking for both.
Am I speaking for fuck? Sorry, is this being recorded? Yeah. So, I mean, yes, Pramesh. I think... So for someone like Sobukwe, for example, the target is liberalism because of how it structures apartheid, right? So the apartheid discourse is not going to admit any hint of Marxism to it, even though we could argue that there is a lot in there. For negritude, I mean, Césaire is very critical of the Marxist project. I mean, he famously breaks from the Communist Party, and I mean, his discourse on colonialism is in many ways written to suggest that this is a deeper problem than the one of Marxism or liberalism. They both share a terrain that needs to be undone, that produces racial bodies. And so it's not enough to turn Hegel on his head, right? You actually need to change the terrain on which Hegel might stand, regardless of if he's on his feet or his head. I mean, so I don't know if that really gets, I mean, I don't know if you're trying to push me towards something else in your question, but yes, I mean, but I think for our time today, it's very useful to also read arguments like that of the Black consciousness movement or of negritude as posing a question to liberalism because of how liberalism has set itself up as the guardian of difference in the world, right? Respecting the particularity of differences, which on the one hand is, I mean, it staves off the crisis of violence, but on the other hand, it maintains the conditions of possibility for that very violence. As we see in Hernley, who I quoted, he's a liberal philosopher working against apartheid in his understanding. He argues for apartheid as the most adequate response to the problem of difference in a society marked by a racial chauvinism. So, you know, I mean, and he saw that as a logical thrust of liberalism. So, you know, there is that haunting there, which I think is worth paying attention to.
We have about 9 more minutes. Ashley, were you answered? No. Yes, I just wanted to mark this. You know, sometimes these hospitalities really war with each other. And I know that last night, for many people, there was a real internal war going on as to whether their hospitality should be to the community here and to the keynote, or whether it should be their kinship on the street. And I just want to note that sometimes it's always the gender and, you know, Ashley's question was not answered. So I'm going to ask Heidi and Gaby, who asked a question, and then will you answer in the second round? Sure. Thank you.
I was going to
No, just, I think it'll just be faster this way. So can Heidi and Gaby ask?
Could I ask something as well?
Or I don't know who was first. Okay. Okay, it's also a question in relation to Andres's language of kinship, but specifically in how you linked it to wandering and displacement. And I want to throw out the idea that under certain conditions, foreign language can really also function as a sanctuary. And that relates back to what Patrick brought into the discussion when he asked, do we become a different person? In a way, can the space of translation can a foreign language be a space of translation for what cannot be metabolized in one's own language? And to make it a little more concrete, I want to link it to the example. I wrote a book, Haunting Legacies, about my legacy of being born in Germany after World War II. I am absolutely convinced I could never have written that book in German. For me, the English was served as a kind of protective space that created exactly the distance from the German I needed to even voice what I felt I needed to voice. And this has to do with language and subject formation in a way, because it also has to do with what Alejandro brought into the discussion with the term an original division. So that in a sense we are always divided against ourselves or strangers to ourselves. And in that sense, a foreign language can become a protected space to retranslate ourselves to ours. It's also resonating with what someone brought into the discussion with the term transfer operations and so on. I'll just stop here. I hope it has come across.
I just wanted to ask, it's a question for all the speakers, really, maybe for all of us, about how we're thinking about the relationship between language practices that are necessarily different. So I was really struck in the relationship between Andres' paper and Alejandro's. So Andres was making an argument about all language, really. Alejandro was making an argument specifically about poetic language. And as soon as we make that move, I mean, one of the things we've done over the last 2 weeks is talked about poetic language, and then we've made a move that goes from that to language in general. But as soon as we're configuring something as poetic language, in fact, we're bringing into being an idea of language that's not poetic. And so, I mean, a move made by sociolinguistics is to say that any kind of creative language thing you can find in poetry, you can find in everyday conversation. Nevertheless, though, when something like that is offered as a poem rather than just kind of a bit of inventive chat, it's offered. It conjures up an implied monolingualism or an implied different kind of language that's being brought into relationship with it. I did a book once that was all about the inventiveness that was brought into English by translation. It celebrated, difference, multilingualism, etc. But I realized, unfortunately, only after I'd done it, that the whole frame in which I was describing it was assuming a monolingual reader who was going to be surprised by the encounter with the multilingual, and was assuming the continuing presence of a national tradition that was always going to be challenged by the mixing. And, as soon as we use the word enrichment, we make that move of assuming something monolingual that is always going to enjoy being challenged by the multilingual and therefore always remain in place. So basically, and also this is what we're doing in this room, necessarily. We're celebrating creative, translational, translinguistic, interlinguistic language practices, and yet the community that we're constructing is a monolingual one. We're talking about, care for the construction of subjectivity, but on the whole, under the pressure of time, given that we all share in academic practices, we're taking each other's subjectivities for granted. We're keen to put stuff across. We're behaving in a way that is much more in line with the metaphors of language as channel, with the idea of language as a shared communicative medium, than it is in line with the ideas of language that we're talking about. And I think that necessarily has to be the case, but I also think it would be good to have some sort of consideration of how that relates, really. What the relation, how the kinds of language practice that we are advocating, celebrating, theorize, where they sit in relation to language practices, including our own, which are necessarily different from that. And really.
Okay, thank you. Can everyone just go respond as concisely as possible so that, we can move on to lunch.
Okay, Gabby, thank you very much. And I think that your example, it goes precisely to the heart of what I was saying. I mean, the interesting thing here is that your German language had an inner resistance about which it knew nothing about, until another language, English, showed your origin, that it had an inner resistance, and it was there. But you had to do like the whole process to see that there was an internal resistance of which German knew nothing about. So it is this movement that Lezama is really trying to figure out now, how we are inhabited by resistance, and we need to unfold them going through the other, and so they can unpack themselves. Yeah.
Okay, very quickly, a clarification about what I was saying before. Language of kinship, I took it as the normal question, as a traditional question. And the way of answering was through translation. I also used a lot the word contagion and contamination, which also stresses the other side, which is the unavoidable conflict there's always been in relationship. Hospitality is if it were hospitality so simple, we would practice it all the time. Hospitality implies also being open to moments of violence in which you not expect what happens. Now, Gabriela's question, I completely agree with you, and I think that this language that I put it of kinship as translation, as displacement, has to do also with several layers in which you can liberate yourself through language. Some can be very empirical, that you liberate, for instance, from oppression by using another language. Actually, we were talking the other day for 1 minute with Beatriz Sarlo of the ambiguity between snobism, but also liberation that foreign languages allowed to women in the beginning of the 20th century, where they could write poetry and express themselves in French or in English, and although it was it had the double side of snobism, but at the other time it had the side of the liberation. They could write things that they could never write in Spanish, because it was seen as a genre which allowed them to say things they couldn't say in their own language. I think now coming to the more strict, closing the focus on different internal languages to a language, a little bit what Matthew was doing, I think also academic language or poetry language, to put both extremes, can be used inside a language to say things you wouldn't be able to say like in normal language. Okay, so I think that sometimes you can do political criticism hidden in academic language which you couldn't do like in normal language, and that's an empirical side. But then there's something which is more of the internal phenomenology of the constitution of the subject. I think that one can also liberate from oneself using a foreign language. I mean, you are normally you're bringing a language in a society, you have codes, your language says things about yourself, and then you suddenly go to another country, start speaking another language, and you can say, well, who do I want to invent in this language? So you start picking elective affinities, to use the expression, which are not the imposed categories and linguistic codes you were taught as a child. It happens to couples, multilingual couples, that you switch languages according to the mood or the subject you're speaking. When you want to fight, you might use one language, and when you want to do something else, you might use another. But but so yeah, I think that is question. And then to Matthew's question, very quickly, I think I do the difference, but I think it's a difference that has to be explained, and it's also between poetic and non-poetic language. It is a difference that has to be explained, and that is also a matter of perspective. It's not that one language is poetic and one language is not poetic. But I think that when I speak about the poetic function of language, I'm not saying at all, it has nothing to do with poetry. At all. I mean, any use of the language can be poetic. When I say the poetic use of language, which is not poetry as a genre at all, although poetry is kind of a lab for that kind of poetic use of language, because it's a place where language is forced to do new things, is when language recovers or stresses the synthetic and not the communicative part of it. Because before communicating meaning or a world, you have to constitute it, you have to represent it. And when language is doing that representative role, where I was speaking about this synthesis, I mean this linking, and is stressing that, I call it poetic function of language. But it's not, obviously it's not all languages synthetic and communicative at the same time, but it has nothing to do with poetry as a genre. I mean, at least in the uses I was doing of it.
Yeah, quickly, Matthew. I think I used Poetics of Negritude because the bulk of the writing that's done on negritude is poetry, right? But I want to answer Ashley here real quick. I think the question of gender is really important with the Nardal sisters, especially the prose they wrote, right? They didn't write poetry. And my process of translation is that I do a first translation and share it with a female perspective. So, for example, I have a lot of colleagues who are translators and have them read them and criticize my translation. And that conversation, I think it's important, right? It shouldn't be one perspective. And that's actually the only chapter that I employ that kind of practice, right? I want a second eyes in a translation and make sure it's not sort of like, you know, I'm doing the right thing to the language. Does that help?
Very quickly. I'll take another half an hour. I think that so my response might be a little different to Matthew's question, where, I mean, I would suggest that, yeah, difference, great, right? I don't think there's any problem with producing difference or with difference manifesting or being an expression, right? So when we have different modes of expression that allow us to articulate different potentialities, I think that's brilliant. The problem comes in when you reify those differences. So I mean, yeah. So I think differences. I mean, we're all, each of us, different, and we're all each speaking a different English, even while we're speaking English around this table. I mean, we have different, potentialities and blah blah blah, and how we speak, and I think that's fine. I think the same happens in terms of, you know, how we are in the world, right? So difference isn't something to be afraid of, as I guess what I'm saying. It's just something that we're aware of, yeah. Which the flip side of that comes in when, how do we deal with differences that have been elided? Which I think is something that Baba has been putting on the table with his presentation. And, you know, there's been quite a bit of writing on this in relation to Black consciousness and to negritude as well. And I think the risk in doing the necessary work of showing where different perspectives have been elided is that one inadvertently reifies that different perspective, right? So I think that's where our task becomes really difficult. Yeah, just, I don't think there are any other questions.
Okay, unless there's a really urgent question, can we just once again thank a really wonderful panel?